No one crosses the Moretti family and lives to tell the tale. But when a ruthless mob boss witnesses a broke, exhausted waitress risk her own life to shield his 6-year-old daughter from a spray of bullets, his next move defies every rule of the underworld. The city watched, stunned. The neon sign outside Callahan's diner flickered with a persistent, annoying buzz, casting a harsh pink glow over the rain-slicked pavement of South Boston. It was 11:45 p.m. on a dreary Tuesday, the kind of night that kept honest people indoors and drew the desperate out into the damp chill. Inside, Chloe Bennett wiped down the cracked laminate of counter stool number 4 for the 3rd time. She was exhausted. Her blonde hair, usually pulled into a neat ponytail, had loose strands clinging to her damp forehead. At 24, she carried the weight of a woman twice her age, burdened by a mountain of medical debt left behind by her late mother and a landlord who treated eviction threats like a morning greeting. The bell above the glass door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the ancient refrigerator. Chloe looked up, pasting on a customer service smile that didn't quite reach her tired green eyes. 2 figures stepped in from the rain. The first was a mountain of a man in a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in a diner that smelled of stale grease and black coffee. But it was the second figure that caught Chloe's attention. A little girl, no older than 6, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one hand and the giant man's coat with the other. She had dark, soulful eyes and a pristine pink dress that remained completely untouched by the city's grime. "Just a booth, please," the man said. His voice was gravelly, his eyes scanning the empty diner with a hyper-vigilant intensity. He was a bodyguard, Chloe realized instantly. You didn't grow up in this neighborhood without learning how to spot muscle. "Take any booth you like," Chloe said softly, gesturing to the back. The man ushered the little girl Mia into a corner booth facing the door. He ordered a hot chocolate for the girl and a black coffee for himself. For 10 minutes, the diner returned to its quiet rhythm. Chloe steamed milk, watching the little girl color on a napkin. It was a picture of innocence in a city that rarely allowed such things to survive. Then, the bodyguard's burner phone vibrated. He glanced at the caller ID, his jaw tightening. He looked at Mia, then at Chloe. "Keep an eye on her. I need to take this outside." 30 seconds. It was a fatal miscalculation. The moment the heavy glass door swung shut behind the bodyguard, a black sedan screeched to a halt at the curb. 2 men burst into the diner. They wore heavy leather jackets, their faces obscured by the shadows of their lowered baseball caps. But their intent was as loud as a siren. They bypassed the counter entirely, their eyes locked on the little girl in the corner booth. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't know who these men were foot soldiers for the rival Volkov syndicate, though she wouldn't learn that until later, but she recognized the predatory angle of their approach. "Hey," Chloe shouted, her voice cracking as she rounded the counter. "We're closed!" The larger of the 2 men didn't even look at her. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a silenced pistol. The second man lunged toward the booth, his hands outstretched toward the terrified little girl. Mia screamed, dropping her stuffed rabbit, freezing like a deer in headlights. Chloe didn't think. Instinct, raw and unpolished, hijacked her exhausted body. She grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a freshly brewed glass pot of scalding hot, dark roast coffee. With a burst of adrenaline, she sprinted across the checkered linoleum floor and hurled the boiling contents directly into the face of the man reaching for Mia. The thug let out a blood-curdling shriek as the liquid blistered his skin, stumbling backward and crashing into a table. "You stupid bitch!" the second man roared, turning his weapon toward Chloe. "Get down!" Chloe screamed. She dove into the booth, wrapping her arms around Mia and throwing all her weight sideways, dragging the little girl down beneath the heavy oak table just as the sharp thwip of the silenced pistol echoed through the room. A bullet tore through the air, grazing the top of Chloe's left shoulder. Searing pain exploded down her arm, but she bit down on her lip, refusing to cry out. She curled her body over Mia's, shielding the trembling child with her own flesh, as a second bullet shattered the diner's front window, showering them in broken safety glass. Before the shooter could adjust his aim, the diner doors blew open with terrifying force. Gunfire erupted, deafening and unsuppressed. The sound of bodies hitting the floor vibrated through the floorboards. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath, waiting for the final blow. But the diner fell deathly silent, save for the patter of rain coming through the broken window. Mia. The voice was low, commanding, and laced with a terrifying authority. It was a voice that commanded armies in the shadows. Chloe cautiously opened her eyes and peered over the edge of the booth. The two attackers were dead on the floor. Standing amidst the shattered glass was Lorenzo Moretti. He was a striking man in his early 30s, clad in an immaculate midnight blue suit that contrasted sharply with the violence surrounding him. His sharp jawline was tight with fury, but his dark, piercing eyes were frantically searching the wreckage. Slowly, Chloe rose, her left arm hanging uselessly at her side, blood seeping through her white uniform shirt. In her right arm she held Mia securely against her hip. Mia saw the man and burst into fresh tears. "Papa!" Lorenzo crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He took his daughter from Chloe's arms, crushing the little girl to his chest, burying his face in her hair. For a brief, unguarded second, the ruthless head of the Moretti crime family looked entirely vulnerable. When Lorenzo finally lifted his head, his gaze locked onto Chloe. He took in her bleeding shoulder, her pale, terrified face, and the shattered glass dusting her hair. He noted the dead men, the spilled coffee, and the realization of what this civilian had just done hit him with the force of a freight train. She had thrown herself in front of a bullet meant for his blood. "Get her to the private clinic," Lorenzo ordered, his voice echoing in the ruined diner. He didn't break eye contact with Chloe. Now, the underground clinic was entirely off the books, hidden beneath a luxury veterinary hospital in the affluent West End. Chloe's shoulder had been stitched, bandaged, and flooded with high-grade painkillers by a doctor who didn't ask a single question. Within hours, she had been driven back to her cramped, drafty apartment in a black SUV with tinted windows. For 3 days, Chloe lived in a state of paranoid suspension. She locked her deadbolt, jumped at every siren, and stared at the water stain on her ceiling. She knew exactly who Lorenzo Moretti was. Everyone in the city knew. He was the ghost who pulled the strings of the local government, a man who built an empire on fear and absolute loyalty. And she had accidentally thrown herself directly into his orbit. On the 4th morning, a sharp knock rattled her flimsy front door. Chloe grabbed a kitchen knife, her heart hammering as she peered through the peephole. Standing in the hallway was a distinguished-looking older man with silver hair, holding a sleek leather briefcase. "Miss Bennett," the man called out politely. "My name is Arthur. Mr. Moretti sent me." "May I come in?" Reluctantly, Chloe opened the door, keeping the chain fastened. "What does he want?" "Mr. Moretti requests your presence at his estate," Arthur said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "A car is waiting downstairs. You will be perfectly safe. You have my word." An hour later, Chloe found herself standing in the cavernous, marble-floored foyer of the Moretti estate. It was a sprawling mansion secluded behind wrought-iron gates and acres of manicured woods. The sheer opulence of the place made her feel painfully small in her faded jeans and oversized sweater. Arthur led her down a long hallway lined with classical art, opening a set of heavy mahogany doors. Lorenzo Moretti stood behind a massive oak desk in his study. Without his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he looked less like a corporate CEO and more like a predator pacing its cage. He was pouring a glass of amber liquid. "Sit, Miss Bennett," Lorenzo said, gesturing to a leather wingback chair. Chloe remained standing, her good hand gripping the strap of her cheap canvas bag. "I'd rather stand, Mr. Moretti. I want to know why I'm here." Lorenzo stopped pouring. He looked up, his dark eyes analyzing her. She wasn't cowering. She was trembling slightly. Yes, but her chin was tilted upward in defiance. He walked around the desk, leaning against the edge of it, closing the distance between them. 3 days ago, Lorenzo began, his voice a low, mesmerizing baritone. My enemies attempted to strike at my only vulnerability. My men failed to protect her. You, a complete stranger with nothing to gain and everything to lose, stepped in front of a loaded gun for my daughter. She's a little girl, Chloe said defensively. No, Lorenzo corrected softly. They wouldn't have. They would have run. He reached onto his desk and picked up a manila folder. Chloe Bennett, 24. Mother passed away 2 years ago, after a long battle with cancer. You inherited $45,000 in medical debt. You work 60 hours a week. Your landlord has filed for eviction 3 times in the last year. You are drowning. Chloe's face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. You investigated me? I investigate everyone who breathes near my family, Lorenzo stated coldly. He tossed the folder onto the desk. I am a man who honors his debts, Miss Bennett. The Moretti family owes you a debt of blood. That is not something I take lightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy brass key, placing it on the desk next to a cashier's check. That check will clear your mother's medical debt, pay off your student loans, and leave you with a comfortable cushion, Lorenzo explained. The key belongs to a newly renovated townhouse in the Diamond District. The deed is already in your name. It's yours. Completely. Chloe stared at the paper and the brass key. It was a lifeline. It was the end of her suffering, the end of sleepless nights calculating grocery bills. It was a miracle wrapped in blood money. And what's the catch? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed slightly. Excuse me? People like you don't just hand over houses and fortunes out of the goodness of their hearts, Chloe said, stepping back. What do you want in return? For a moment, Lorenzo was silent. His gaze was heavy, calculating. I want you to move in here, into the estate. Mia hasn't spoken a word since the incident at the diner. She wakes up screaming every night. The only thing she asks for is the blonde girl from the restaurant. I want you to be her live-in guardian. Chloe's breath hitched. You want me to work for the Mafia. I want you to protect my daughter's peace of mind. Lorenzo corrected sharply. You will be paid a salary that rivals a corporate executive. You will be protected by my men. You will never want for anything again. It was a stunning move. The untouchable Lorenzo Moretti was inviting a civilian waitress into the inner sanctum of his dangerous world. Chloe looked at the check. She thought about her drafty apartment, the constant fear of starvation. Then she looked at Lorenzo, seeing the danger radiating from him, the cold violence that built the walls of this beautiful mansion. Slowly, Chloe reached out. She didn't touch the check. She pushed the brass key back across the mahogany desk toward Lorenzo. Keep your money, Mr. Moretti, Chloe said, her voice finally steady. And keep your house. I saved Mia because she's an innocent child. Not because I wanted a payout from a criminal. I'm not for sale. Lorenzo froze. The silence in the study was deafening. In his entire life, no one had ever pushed a fortune back across a table to him. No one had ever looked him in the eye and refused his protection. A strange, unfamiliar spark ignited in his dark eyes as he looked at the penniless waitress, standing bravely in his study. You're making a mistake, Miss Bennett, he murmured, taking a slow step toward her. I have to go, Chloe whispered, turning on her heel and marching toward the heavy doors, leaving the most dangerous man in the city, standing in stunned silence. The walk back to her apartment felt like a death march. The adrenaline that had sustained Chloe through the shootout and her tense standoff with Lorenzo Moretti had completely evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Her left shoulder throbbed with a relentless, burning rhythm. The painkillers from the underground clinic already beginning to lose their edge. When she finally reached the 3rd floor of her dilapidated building, she stopped dead in her tracks. Taped to the center of her peeling wooden door was a bright pink piece of paper. Notice of eviction. 48 hours to vacate. Chloe reached out with her good hand, tearing the paper from the wood. She stepped inside her apartment, locking the deadbolt behind her, and slid down the back of the door until she hit the scuffed linoleum floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and finally allowed herself to cry. She had just walked away from enough money to change her entire life. She had handed back a brass key that would have meant safety, warmth, and a full pantry. But as she sat in the dark, listening to the drip of the leaky kitchen faucet, she knew she couldn't have taken it. Blood money came with strings. And Lorenzo Moretti was a man who owned everything he touched. She refused to be a line item on a Mafia boss's ledger. Across the city, in the hushed, cavernous study of the Moretti estate, Lorenzo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain lash against the glass. The brass key and the cashier's check still sat untouched on his mahogany desk. Arthur, his silver-haired consigliere, stood quietly near the doorway. She actually walked out. She did, Lorenzo murmured, his voice a mixture of disbelief and deep, unsettling fascination. Should I have her followed, sir? Lorenzo turned, his dark eyes snapping with sudden intensity. The Volkov syndicate lost 2 men at that diner. Victor Volkov is a rabid dog. He won't care that she's a civilian. He'll see her as a loose end, or worse, a pawn to get to me. Put Gideon and a 4-man detail on her. Keep them in the shadows. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will hold you personally responsible. Understood, Arthur nodded, slipping out of the room. Lorenzo rubbed his temples. The silence of the mansion was oppressive, broken only by the faint, agonizing sound of Mia, whimpering in her sleep 2 floors above. His daughter had not spoken a single syllable since the diner. The best pediatric psychologists in the state had visited the estate, and all had offered the same useless platitudes about time and trauma. The only time Mia showed any sign of life was when she pointed frantically at the door, silently demanding the blonde woman who had shielded her from the glass. 2 days passed. Chloe's life disintegrated with terrifying speed. Callahan's diner had been boarded up by the city due to the police investigation, leaving her entirely without income. Her phone was shut off. On the afternoon of her eviction, with a single canvas duffel bag packed with her meager belongings, Chloe walked down to the corner pharmacy to buy cheap gauze for her wound using the last $4 in her pocket. The bell above the pharmacy door jingled as she stepped back out into the grey afternoon. She turned down the narrow alleyway that served as a shortcut to the subway station. Halfway down the brick corridor, a shadow detached itself from the fire escape. Miss Bennett. A voice rasped. Chloe froze. A man stepped into the light. He wore a heavy leather jacket, and the crude tattoo of a wolf, the mark of the Volkov syndicate, crawled up his neck. Before Chloe could turn, a second man stepped out from behind a dumpster, blocking her exit. Victor wants a word with the girl who burned his cousin's face off. The first man sneered, pulling a heavy, serrated combat knife from his belt, and he figures Moretti might pay a premium to get you back in one piece. Or, several pieces. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Chloe's veins. She dropped her duffel bag, clutching her wounded shoulder. I don't know anything. I just work at the diner. Not anymore, sweetheart. The second man laughed, lunging forward to grab her hair. He never made it. The crack of a suppressed gunshot echoed with a sickening thwip. The man reaching for Chloe collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, a neat hole perfectly centered in his forehead. The first man spun around, raising his knife, but a massive figure descended from the fire escape with terrifying speed. It was Gideon, Lorenzo's head of security. He moved like a freight train, slamming the Volkov thug against the brick wall with a sickening crunch of bone. Gideon didn't hesitate. He drove his knee into the man's ribs, disarmed him in a blur of motion, and knocked him unconscious with the heavy steel butt of his pistol. The alley fell dead silent. Chloe was backed against the damp brick, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. Gideon holstered his weapon and turned to her. His face was an unreadable mask of professional stone. He reached down, picked up her canvas duffel bag, and slung it over his massive shoulder. Mr. Moretti extends his apologies for the fright. Miss Bennett, Gideon said calmly, gesturing toward the street where a black-armored SUV had just pulled up, its back door swinging open. But as you can see, the city is no longer safe for you. Please get in the car. Chloe looked at the bodies, then at the waiting vehicle. Her pride had almost gotten her killed. She had no home, no money, and now a target on her back. With tears of pure frustration stinging her eyes, she stepped out of the alley and climbed into the back of the SUV. The guest suite at the Moretti estate was larger than Chloe's entire former apartment building. It featured vaulted ceilings, walls adorned with muted silk wallpaper, and a massive four-poster bed that felt like a cloud. Yet, as Chloe sat on the edge of the mattress staring out the reinforced, bulletproof window into the sprawling, heavily guarded gardens, it felt exactly like what it was. A beautiful, impenetrable cage. A soft, hesitant knock broke her reverie. The heavy mahogany door clicked open, and Mia peeked inside. The little girl was dressed in a lavish silk nightgown, her dark curls tumbling over her shoulders, her small arms clutching the same battered stuffed rabbit from the diner. Chloe's hardened exterior instantly melted. She patted the space next to her on the bed. "Hi, Mia." "It's okay, you can come in." Mia padded silently across the plush Persian rug and climbed onto the bed. She didn't say a word, but she curled her small body into Chloe's side, resting her head carefully against Chloe's uninjured arm. Chloe wrapped her arm around the child, resting her chin on Mia's soft hair. In this terrifying, blood-soaked world, this little girl was the only pure thing left. "She hasn't left her room voluntarily in almost a week." Chloe looked up. Lorenzo was leaning against the doorframe. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of dark ink spanning his collarbone. The harsh lighting of the hallway cast shadows across his sharp cheekbones, making him look incredibly tired and dangerously handsome. "She's terrified, Mr. Moretti," Chloe whispered, not wanting to disturb the child. She saw monsters. Lorenzo stepped fully into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He walked over to a velvet armchair near the window and sat down, his dark eyes fixed on the two of them. "And what do you see, Miss Bennett?" "When you look at me, I see a man who brings monsters to his daughter's doorstep," Chloe replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. She wasn't going to cower. A muscle feathered in Lorenzo's jaw. Most men would have been dragged out back and shot for speaking to him that way. But Lorenzo merely nodded, accepting the blow. "Mia's mother, Serena, was murdered 3 years ago," Lorenzo said softly, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. "It was a car bomb, meant for me, planted by Viktor Volkov's father. Mia was in the house. She heard the blast. Since then, I have built an empire of blood to ensure no one could ever touch her again. But I made a miscalculation. I thought fear was a shield. I was wrong." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his intense gaze locking onto Chloe's green eyes. "You protected her when my men failed. You gave up everything rather than take my money. You are the only person in this city I can trust because you are the only one who wants nothing from me. I need you to stay, not as a prisoner, but as her guardian." Chloe looked down at Mia, whose breathing had evened out into a deep, peaceful sleep. She thought about the dark alley and the cold barrel of the gun. She couldn't go back, but she refused to be owned. "If I stay," Chloe said firmly, "we do this on my terms. I am not your property. I am an employee. I want a standard contract. I want a salary, and I want it taxed legally. And most importantly, you do not use me to clean up your conscience." A slow, devastatingly attractive smirk ghosted across Lorenzo's lips. It was the first time she had seen anything resembling a smile on his face. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Bennett, but you have a deal. Over the next 2 weeks, a strange new rhythm developed within the estate. Chloe became a fixture in the mansion. She read to Mia, walked with her in the enclosed gardens, and slowly coaxed the life back into the little girl. While Mia still hadn't spoken, the night terrors had stopped. Lorenzo was a constant, brooding presence. He was always watching. Chloe would catch his gaze lingering on her across the grand dining table, or feel his eyes tracking her as she moved through the library. There was an undeniable, crackling tension between them, a dangerous pull between the ruthless mob boss and the defiant waitress. They sparred verbally daily. But Chloe noticed that Lorenzo had stopped bringing his capos into the main house, effectively shielding her and Mia from the ugliest parts of his business. But the bubble of safety was an illusion. It was past midnight on a Thursday. Chloe couldn't sleep. The heavy, humid air of a pending summer storm made her restless. She slipped out of her suite, padding barefoot down the grand staircase, toward the massive kitchen for a glass of water. As she passed the darkened corridor leading to the estate's security hub, a sliver of light caught her eye. The door to the communications room was cracked open. Chloe froze. The security hub was strictly off-limits, requiring retinal clearance to enter. Curiosity warring with caution, she pressed her back against the cool marble wall and inched closer, holding her breath. Inside, a hushed, frantic voice was speaking in rapid, hushed tones. "I'm telling you, the rotation changes at 3:00 a.m. on Sunday," the voice whispered. "Gideon pulls the perimeter team back for shift. There's a 3-minute blind spot on the east service gate." Chloe recognized the voice instantly. It was Harrison, the meticulously polite, impeccably dressed estate manager who had worked for the Moretti family for over a decade. "Yes, I know she's always with the girl," Harrison hissed into a burner phone. "You want Moretti to bleed? You take them both. I'll disable the internal alarms on the east wing. Just make sure my offshore account is padded by Monday." A cold, paralyzing dread washed over Chloe. A mole. The Volkovs hadn't given up. They had just bought the man who held the keys to the castle. They were coming for Mia, and they were coming for her. Chloe took a careful step backward, desperate to retreat and find Lorenzo, but as she shifted her weight, her bare foot brushed against a heavy, antique bronze vase resting on a pedestal. It wobbled precariously. Chloe lunged to catch it, but her injured shoulder seized up. The vase crashed onto the marble floor with the deafening roar of a bomb. The voice in the security room snapped silent. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and ran blindly into the dark. The crash of the antique bronze vase echoed through the cavernous, silent mansion like a detonated explosive. Chloe didn't wait to see Harrison's face. She spun around, her bare feet slipping momentarily on the cold, polished marble before finding purchase. Ignoring the sharp, tearing agony that flared in her healing shoulder, she sprinted blindly toward the grand staircase. "Miss Bennet!" Harrison's voice hissed from the dark corridor behind her. It was entirely stripped of its usual refined British polish. It was the frantic, guttural snarl of a man who knew his death warrant had just been signed. Heavy, hurried footsteps slapped against the floorboards in pursuit. Chloe's lungs burned as she took the stairs 2 at a time, her good hand gripping the mahogany banister to haul herself upward. She needed to reach the east wing. She needed to reach Lorenzo. As she crested the landing, a strong hand clamped around her uninjured arm, yanking her violently into the shadows of a velvet-draped alcove. Chloe opened her mouth to scream, but a large palm clamped firmly over her lips. "Quiet," a deep, rumbling voice commanded near her ear. It was Lorenzo. He was wearing dark tactical trousers and a black t-shirt. A heavy, suppressed automatic pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. His dark eyes were wide with a lethal, predatory alertness. He slowly removed his hand from her mouth. "Harrison!" Chloe gasped, her chest heaving as she pressed her back against Lorenzo's chest. "He's a mole. He's on the phone with the Volkovs right now. He's going to open the east service gate at 3:00 a.m. on Sunday. But he knows I heard him. He's panicking." Lorenzo's entire body went rigid. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees, radiating a suffocating, murderous intent. He didn't ask her if she was sure. He didn't demand proof. He looked into her terrified green eyes and believed her implicitly. "Gideon," Lorenzo whispered into a small earpiece he was wearing. "Harrison is compromised. Execute Protocol Black. Lock down the east wing." Now, before Lorenzo could move, the heavy oak doors at the bottom of the staircase burst open. Harrison stood at the bottom of the steps, a sleek silver revolver trembling in his hands. His face was pale, slick with panicked sweat. He pointed the gun upward into the shadows where Lorenzo and Chloe stood concealed. "I know you're up there, boss," Harrison called out, his voice cracking. "I didn't want it to go down like this, but Victor Volkov made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And now that the girl knows, Victor's men aren't waiting until Sunday. They're coming through the gate right now." As if on cue, the deafening wail of the estate's perimeter breach alarms shattered the night. Red emergency lights bathed the grand foyer in a hellish, strobing glow. The Volkov syndicate hadn't waited for Sunday. Harrison had given them the green light early to save his own skin. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the alcove, positioning his body entirely in front of Chloe. Without a single word of warning or negotiation, Lorenzo raised his weapon and fired 2 rapid, suppressed shots. Harrison collapsed backward onto the marble floor, his revolver clattering uselessly away. "Come with me." Lorenzo grabbed Chloe's hand, his grip unyielding, as he pulled her down the opposite hallway. The estate erupted into chaos. The muffled pops of gunfire echoed from the lower levels as Gideon and the security team engaged the Volkov intruders. Lorenzo bypassed his own suite, kicking open the door to Mia's bedroom. The little girl was sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her dark eyes wide with renewed terror. "Papa!" she cried silently, tears streaming down her face. Lorenzo scooped her up with his free arm, pressing her face into his neck. He ushered Chloe toward a massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf at the far end of the room. Reaching behind a row of leather-bound encyclopedias, he pressed a hidden panel. The heavy bookcase slid backward with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a steel-reinforced panic room. "Get inside," Lorenzo ordered, pushing Chloe and Mia into the small, brightly lit space. It was stocked with medical supplies, monitors displaying the estate's security feeds, and a communications terminal. "Lorenzo, you can't go back out there," Chloe pleaded, her hand catching his wrist. Her fear for her own life was suddenly eclipsed by a paralyzing fear for him. "There are too many of them." Lorenzo paused. He looked down at her hand wrapped around his wrist, then up to her desperate face. For a fleeting second, the ruthless Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at the only woman who had ever dared to stand up to him. He reached up, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. "No one breaches my home and lives, Chloe," he said softly, the vow written in the absolute darkness of his eyes. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." The bookcase slid shut, plunging the room into a heavy metallic silence. Chloe immediately engaged the deadbolts, sinking to the floor and pulling Mia into her lap. On the security monitors, the battle for the Moretti estate unfolded in brutal, violent black and white. For 20 agonizing minutes, Chloe watched Lorenzo and Gideon systematically dismantle the Volkov assault team. Lorenzo moved with terrifying precision, a ghost in the shadows of his own home, neutralizing threats with cold, calculated efficiency. Finally, she saw the main doors blow open as Victor Volkov himself entered the fray, flanked by heavily armed guards. Chloe held her breath as Lorenzo cornered Victor in the main study. The security feed possessed no audio, making the brutal hand-to-hand combat that ensued look like a silent, macabre dance. It ended with Lorenzo standing victorious over Victor's motionless body. An hour later, the hydraulic hiss of the bookcase mechanism broke the silence of the panic room. Chloe scrambled to her feet, pulling Mia behind her. The steel door swung open. Lorenzo stood in the doorway. His black shirt was torn. His knuckles were bruised and bleeding, and a shallow cut traced his jawline. But he was alive. The estate was secure. He dropped his weapon onto a side table and sank to his knees. Opening his arms, Mia ran to him, burying her face in his chest. Lorenzo held his daughter tightly, but his eyes were locked on Chloe. Slowly, Chloe stepped forward, dropping to her knees beside them. She reached out, her trembling hand resting gently on Lorenzo's uninjured shoulder. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned his head against hers, a heavy, exhausted sigh escaping his lips. "It's over," he whispered into the quiet room. Mia pulled back from her father's chest. She looked at Lorenzo, and then she turned her dark, soulful eyes to Chloe. She reached out her small hand, wrapping her fingers around Chloe's thumb. "Thank you," Mia whispered, her voice raspy from weeks of silence. "Thank you, Chloe." Tears spilled over Chloe's eyelashes. She looked at the little girl she had bled for, and then at the dangerous, complicated man who had turned his empire upside down to protect them both. She had refused his money, and she had rejected his gilded cage. But as the first light of dawn crept through the shattered windows of the estate, Chloe realized she wasn't an employee anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. What a breathtaking finale. From a gritty diner shootout to an explosive siege at a Mafia mansion, Chloe and Lorenzo's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous men will do anything to protect the women who steal their hearts. Will their undeniable bond survive the dark underworld they live in? If you loved this intense Mafia romance, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more heart-stopping stories.